What would you do if you found a 6-year-old girl scrubbing your office floor at midnight? Alone, silent, and acting like she belonged there, not crying, not asking for help, just cleaning as if that sponge was the only thing keeping her from disappearing entirely. Would you call security? Would you walk away, or would you stop and listen? This is the story of Caleb Hart, a millionaire CEO known for building cities, not saving lives, who walked into his glass tower one night and found something he couldn't ignore. A child, a girl named Nina Ruiz, with tired eyes far too old for her age, and no one waiting for her at home. But what began as an impulsive decision to offer shelter became something deeper, more dangerous, and far more human. Because the more Caleb learned about Nina, the more he realized he wasn't just helping her, she was saving him. But how do you fight a system that doesn't care how much you love a child? And what happens when the past you thought was buried comes back and knocks on your door? Stay with us as we unfold this powerful, heartbreaking, and life-changing story of unlikely family, silent strength, and the quiet rebellion of choosing to stay when walking away would be easier. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like these remind us sometimes healing begins with the simple act of not leaving. Now, let's begin. The 39th floor of the Hartwell Tower was a place that rarely slept, but even it had its moments of silence. It was nearly midnight when Caleb Hart stepped out of the elevator, his coat collar damp from the steady drizzle outside, the soft hiss of rain fading behind the glass-encased lobby. The hallway lights had dimmed into a soft amber glow, casting long shadows along the marble floor. The world outside the building was winding down, but inside Caleb's mind, deadlines still screamed and contracts still loomed. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the far corner of the building, where his office overlooked the rainy Seattle skyline. He had built this company, Hartwell Dynamics, from the ground up, brick by brick, hour by hour. He had sacrificed weekends, relationships, and, somewhere along the way, the ability to sleep soundly. Now, all that was left was silence. Silence and structure. In his right hand, he held his phone half scrolling, half thinking. Another email, another delay, another meeting rescheduled. He reached his office door and pushed it open without thinking. What he saw made him stop cold. There was movement in the room. At first, he thought it was a shadow, maybe a trick of the light or the exhaustion playing games with his vision. But no, the silhouette was real, small, and low to the ground, shifting back and forth with quiet focus. A child, a little girl, maybe 6 years old. She was kneeling on the floor near the window, scrubbing at the tiles with a sponge. Her hands were covered by oversized yellow gloves, and her hair, dark, curly, damp in strands, was tied into a loose braid that fell down her back. Beside her was a plastic bucket filled with cloudy water. It sloshed quietly with her every move. She hadn't seen him yet. Caleb stepped in slowly, trying not to startle her. He wasn't sure what to say, or even if he was truly seeing what he thought he was seeing. Was this some late-night maintenance prank? A janitor's child who'd wandered off? He cleared his throat gently. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The girl jumped slightly and turned her head. Her eyes were large, a deep hazel that seemed too calm for her age. She blinked at him, then looked back down, continuing to scrub. "I'm cleaning," she said simply. "You're cleaning." His voice cracked with disbelief. She nodded. My cousin works here at night. I help her. She says if I help, I can sleep on her floor. There was no emotion in her tone, no plea for help, no shame, just the flat declaration of a fact. Caleb stepped further into the room, setting his phone down on the desk without looking. He crouched beside her, his knees creaking in his slacks, eyes level with hers now. You can't be more than 6. What's your name, Nina? She replied, glancing at him briefly before dipping her sponge into the bucket. Nina. What Nina Ruiz? Where are your parents? She didn't answer at first, just kept scrubbing. After a moment, she said quietly, Gone. Caleb felt something in his chest shift. He didn't know what it was, anger, disbelief, guilt, maybe all of them. He looked around the room, trying to place himself, his walls, his floors, his windows, but suddenly, none of it felt like it belonged to him. It felt like he was intruding on something fragile. Nina, he said softly, does your cousin know you're here, that you're working like this? She shrugged. She says it's fair. His jaw tightened. Fair. That word echoed like an insult. A child, left to mop the floors of a corporate office in the middle of the night, because an adult had decided that survival came with terms. Caleb stood up. He moved to the intercom by his desk and called security. But as he waited for them to answer, he looked back down at Nina. She hadn't stopped working, not even when she knew she was being watched, not even when she realized she was caught. Because to her, this wasn't punishment. This was normal. That's what hit him hardest. Not the fact that a child was here, but the fact that she didn't think it was strange. When the security team arrived, 2 uniformed men stepped inside, pausing the moment they saw the girl. One of them looked at Caleb, confused. Sir, do you want us to escort her? No. Caleb cut in. Get me the name of every employee on the cleaning staff tonight, and find out where this girl's cousin is. They nodded and left quickly. Nina remained kneeling. Caleb exhaled slowly and moved to the edge of his desk. He leaned on it and watched her. She didn't look at him. He spoke again, this time softer. You're not going back to clean any more floors tonight. Not here, not anywhere. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something, maybe judgment, maybe anger, but all he gave her was calm. Okay, she whispered, and for a moment, silence filled the office once more. But it wasn't the cold, familiar silence Caleb had always known. It was different now. It was shared. Caleb had seen a lot of things in his life, hostile takeovers, multi-million-dollar construction setbacks, even a small earthquake that once delayed a high-rise project by 4 months. But nothing had unsettled him the way that little girl had. Nina Ruiz. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She hadn't even seemed surprised to be found. When he watched her, crouched over the tile with her sponge, it wasn't desperation he saw. It was discipline, quiet, focused, learned behavior, like someone had taught her that staying small, staying useful, was the key to staying safe. After security had located her cousin, an exhausted woman named Marla, who worked the overnight janitorial shift, Caleb kept his instructions clear and sharp. Marla was escorted out of the building with no fanfare. Her employee badge was revoked on the spot. She had tried to explain, of course, voice rising in defensive desperation, but Caleb hadn't listened. He didn't need to. Nothing she could say would justify leaving a child alone in an office past midnight with a bucket of dirty water. But now, the girl was still here, perched quietly in the break room, legs swinging off the edge of a leather chair, her small frame swallowed by an oversized company hoodie someone had found in a supply closet. Caleb stood just outside the doorway, unsure of what to say, unsure even of what he was doing. This wasn't in the playbook. There was no blueprint for this. He'd built towers, managed thousands of people, signed deals that reshaped city skylines, and yet, here he was, hesitating outside a break room because a 6-year-old girl made the world feel a little sideways. She looked up, as if sensing his presence, though he hadn't made a sound. "You're the boss," she said quietly. "Not a question. A fact." "I guess I am," he replied. "You own the big window," she added, nodding toward his office, the one where the city looks like stars. Caleb gave a small smile. "Yeah, I guess I do. I like that window." "Me too." A pause settled between them, not awkward, just still. Caleb stepped inside and sat across from her. "Not too close." "Where do you live?" "Nina." Her feet stopped swinging. "With Marla," she said finally. "She's my cousin. Her apartment's not very big. Do you go to school sometimes?" He raised an eyebrow. "Sometimes she says I can go when I don't fall asleep." Caleb leaned back, the pieces clicking together in a way he didn't want them to. Night shifts, cleaning floors, a child too tired to learn during the day. "What about your parents?" he asked again. Nina's eyes dropped to her lap. She fiddled with the hem of the hoodie. "Gone," she repeated. She didn't say how, didn't elaborate, and Caleb didn't push. He studied her face for a long moment. She had the kind of expression that didn't match her age too still, too aware. Her hair was still damp at the ends, her hands small. Bony were red from the harsh cleaning solution. She didn't complain. She didn't even seem to notice. He wondered what kind of world teaches a child not to notice when their hands hurt. "I can take you somewhere safe," he said finally. Her brow furrowed, like somewhere you can sleep and eat and not work. Her voice didn't rise, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Will they take me away from her?" "Maybe," he said, honest without being cruel. Nina looked down again. "She's not nice," she whispered, "but she's what I have." The words sat heavy in the air. Caleb felt a tightness in his throat he hadn't expected. It was easy to condemn Marla, easy to remove her from the building and feel righteous about it. But what then? Where did a child like Nina go after that? The system, a shelter. Some temporary bed with a number taped to the frame. He remembered too well what those places felt like. No names, just files. He looked at her again, this small person who hadn't asked for anything, not even water, just sat there, still, waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. "You don't have to stay with her," he said gently, "but you don't have to decide anything tonight." She blinked once, then nodded, and for the first time, her shoulders relaxed just a little. The city hadn't stopped raining. Seattle rarely did in early spring. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hartwell Tower, the skyline looked like a half-forgotten memory buildings blurred behind droplets, lights flickering through fog like ghosts. Inside Caleb's car, the silence was heavier than the clouds. Nina sat in the back seat, still wearing the oversized company hoodie, her legs swinging just above the floor mats. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't asked where they were going. She hadn't asked anything at all. Caleb sat beside her, unusually still for a man used to moving fast. His driver hadn't spoken since picking them up, though Caleb had seen his eyes in the rearview mirror, curious, questioning, but silent. The unspoken question hung in the air. Why was the CEO of Hartwell Dynamics leaving the building at 1 a.m. with a child Caleb couldn't answer it? Not in any way that made sense on paper. This wasn't a decision made from logic. It wasn't strategic or calculated. It didn't fix a problem or optimize a plan. It was impulsive, messy, raw, and yet it felt inevitable. He glanced at Nina. She was looking out the window, watching the rain chase itself across the glass. There was no fear on her face, just the stillness of someone used to being a passenger in other people's choices. "Are you cold?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then softly a little. He nodded and made a note to himself to find something when they got home. Though home was a strange word for the place they were heading, Caleb's penthouse wasn't designed for company. It was sleek and minimal, full of expensive furniture and muted colors. Everything in it had been chosen by a designer. Nothing had fingerprints on it, nothing had life. But tonight, he would be opening the door to someone who didn't fit into any blueprint he'd ever followed. The elevator ride was quiet. Nina didn't flinch at the hum of motion or the soft chime when they reached the top. She followed him without hesitation down the marble-floored hallway, her small sneakers squeaking slightly with every step. He opened the door. The place felt colder than usual. He led her down a short corridor and stopped outside the guest bedroom. It was the only one that hadn't been touched in years. The bed was made, the lamp still worked, and there were spare towels in the drawer. But it wasn't made for a child. He pushed the door open. "This will be your room," he said, trying to soften his voice. "You can use anything you see. I'm just across the hall if you need something." Nina stepped inside, her eyes scanning the space. She didn't ask for toys. She didn't ask where the bathroom was. She simply walked to the edge of the bed and sat down. Her back was straight. Her hands stayed in her lap. "Thank you," she said. He blinked. The politeness caught him off guard, as did the calm in her voice, as if this was just another new room in a long line of unfamiliar spaces she had learned to survive in. "You're welcome," he said, though it didn't feel like enough. He left her there, closing the door gently behind him. For a long moment, he stood in the hallway, staring at the floor. "What are you doing?" The question pressed against his chest. He had just brought a stranger, no, a child into his home, without alerting authorities, without calling social services, without a single legal paper to justify it. He could already hear the backlash. Board members, investors, his lawyer, they would say this was reckless, that it could ruin him, and maybe they were right. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of scotch. The amber liquid swirled slowly in the tumbler, catching reflections of the city through the window. The skyline looked just as it always had, but tonight he felt watched. Not in the sense of surveillance. Watched by his own life, by everything sterile and spotless he had built for himself. And, for the first time, it didn't feel like success. It felt like absence. He stared into the glass, but what he saw wasn't the city. He saw a girl with tired eyes and raw hands, scrubbing a floor like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. And he saw a version of himself, 30 years ago, doing everything he could to stay invisible in a group home hallway. He took a sip, slow. This wasn't logical, but maybe logic wasn't the answer this time. Maybe it never had been. The guest room had always felt like a placeholder. It was the one space in Caleb's penthouse that had never found a purpose. It wasn't used for guests, he rarely had any, and it wasn't decorated like the rest of the apartment. The walls were still the original off-white. The furniture was simple. A twin bed with clean sheets, a small nightstand, a lamp with a soft yellow glow. It was sterile, functional, like the rest of his home. It looked perfect on paper and meant absolutely nothing. But when he peeked into the room the next morning, it looked different. Not because anything had changed, but because someone was in it. Nina was sitting on the edge of the bed, legs tucked up, the oversized hoodie still clinging to her shoulders. Her hair was mussed from sleep, but her face was clean. Her small shoes were neatly placed beside the nightstand, as if she had silently declared, "I may be small, but I'm not messy." She looked up when he knocked softly on the door frame. "Good morning," he said. She nodded. "Good morning. Did you sleep okay? I think so." She rubbed one eye. It was quiet. He stepped into the room, awkward suddenly in his own home. "Would you like some breakfast?" She hesitated. "Yes, please." It wasn't the answer that surprised him. It was the way she said it, not with expectation, not like a child demanding cereal and cartoons, but carefully, as if the words were borrowed and might be taken back at any moment. In the kitchen, Caleb faced his second challenge of the morning, cooking. He rarely used his kitchen. Most of his meals were prepared by a private chef who came 3 times a week and stocked the fridge with labeled containers. But today, he cracked eggs into a bowl with uncertain fingers, turned on the stove top, and stared at a pan like it might protest his lack of experience. Nina sat at the island, hands folded, watching him in silence. He tried not to look over too often, but he could feel her gaze curious but reserved, like she was waiting to see what kind of man he really was, and whether this version of him would last beyond one strange night. The eggs came out a little too soft, but Nina didn't complain. She ate slowly, politely, her posture careful, like she had learned that being too comfortable invited consequences. "You don't have to finish it if you don't like it," he said. "I like it," she replied. Then, after a pause, "It's warm." Caleb sat across from her, sipping coffee. He didn't speak. He wasn't sure how. Every question that came to mind felt too big or too invasive, and yet he wanted to know everything. Who had taught her to be so still? Why did she never ask for anything? What kind of world shaped a child who treated kindness like a fragile gift? When she was done eating, she placed her fork down carefully and wiped her mouth with the napkin he had handed her. "Can I draw?" she asked. That surprised him. Not the request, but the fact that she'd asked at all. "Of course," he said. "There's paper in the study drawer. Crayons, too, I think." She nodded and slipped down from the stool without a sound. Caleb watched her disappear down the hall, her footsteps light as breath. He sat there for a long moment, fingers curled around his coffee mug. His kitchen, once pristine and impersonal, now had a dirty pan on the stove and a small dent in the cushion where she'd sat. It felt better, not warmer exactly, but less hollow. Later that afternoon, he passed the study and noticed a single sheet of paper on the floor just outside the door. He bent down to pick it up. It was a drawing, crayons on printer paper, the lines uneven but deliberate. A tall building, Hartwell Tower, stood in the center of the page. At the very top window, a little girl waved, and below, near the sidewalk, a small figure in a suit looked up at her. Both were smiling. Caleb stared at the page for a long time, longer than he meant to. No one had ever drawn him before, and certainly no one had ever drawn him smiling. The drawing sat on Caleb's desk all morning. He hadn't meant to keep it there, but he couldn't bring himself to move it either. Something about the uneven crayon lines, the crooked smiles, the simplicity of the image it cut through everything else on the polished wood surface. A symbol of something unnameable, something fragile and too new to describe. But outside the boundaries of that drawing, the real world waited, and the real world had rules. By noon, Caleb had made 3 calls to his lawyer, to the head of human resources, and, finally, to his personal assistant, who sounded like she wanted to ask questions but knew better. He didn't have time for speculation. What he needed was answers about custody laws, about emergency guardianship, about risk mitigation, about damage control. "Are you in trouble?" his lawyer asked. Voice tense with the kind of formality that always meant bad news was coming. "I don't know," Caleb replied honestly. "That's why I'm calling you." There was a long pause. "Is this a personal situation?" "Caleb?" He didn't answer right away. "It's a human one," he said finally. By the time he ended the call, his inbox had already started filling with legal documents. Terms like temporary placement, social welfare oversight, and mandatory investigation protocol jumped out at him in stark black and white. He read every word, twice. None of them told him how to comfort a little girl who still asked before touching a crayon. Meanwhile, Nina stayed quiet. She didn't hover, didn't intrude. She moved around the apartment like someone used to making herself invisible. She read in the guest room. She folded the blanket on the couch without being asked. She ate what was given and never left a single crumb behind. That evening, after dinner, Caleb sat across from her at the dining table. "Nina," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, her eyes clear but cautious. "How long have you been staying with Marla?" Nina shrugged. "A while." "Where were you before that?" Another shrug. "Different people. Were they family?" She hesitated. Then, "Not really. Did anyone hurt you?" Her expression changed for the first time in days. Not fear, exactly, but something closed off. "No," she said, "but I had to earn it. Wherever I went. Earn what? Sleep, food, not getting moved again." Caleb sat very still. He wanted to say that's not how it should be. He wanted to tell her that children didn't have to earn love. But he knew deep down that she wouldn't believe him yet, because no one had ever told her otherwise. And that kind of belief took time. Trust took time. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. He found himself in his office, staring at legal documents he had printed hours earlier. The more he read, the more unstable everything began to feel. He had no formal custody, no paperwork, no background check, no proof. If anyone reported this situation, Nina could be taken into protective custody within 24 hours. The thought made his chest tighten. He'd always believed in systems, in structure, in logic. But tonight, the system looked more like a threat than a solution. The next morning, he was answering emails when the building's intercom buzzed. It was security. "Sir, someone from the Department of Child and Family Services is here to see you." He froze. For a moment, he didn't move at all. Then, in a voice far calmer than he felt, he said, "Send them up." He told Nina to stay in her room and open the front door with a mask of composure he had perfected in boardrooms for years. But this was different. This wasn't about investors or zoning permits. This was about Nina. The woman introduced herself as Case Officer Jean Hallbrook, late 40s, clipboard in hand, eyes like steel wrapped in velvet. She wasn't hostile, but she wasn't soft either. "I've received a report that a minor is currently living here without formal placement," she said. "I'd like to speak with her." Caleb nodded stiffly. "She's here. She's safe. She's not going anywhere. I'll be the judge of that," Hallbrook replied, not unkindly. Nina entered the living room quietly. Her stuffed fox was tucked under one arm. She sat on the edge of the sofa like she was waiting for a verdict. Hallbrook asked questions. Simple ones. "What's your name? How old are you?" "Do you feel safe here?" Nina answered softly, but clearly. Then Hallbrook asked, "If you had to leave, where would you want to go?" Nina paused. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I'd try to be small again. So no one gets mad." Caleb looked away. Hallbrook's pen stilled. After the interview, she stood, thanked him, and said, "We'll be in touch." When she left, Caleb closed the door and leaned his forehead against it for a long moment. Later that night, he sat Nina down. He told her the truth, not all of it, but enough. There are people who decide where kids are allowed to live. He explained. They ask questions, and they don't always understand what really matters. "Will they take me?" she asked. "I won't let them," he said. Even if they try, he met her eyes. Even then, the days that followed were strangely quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was. Beneath the stillness of Caleb's apartment, papers moved across desks, decisions were being debated, and reports were filed with acronyms and cautious language: pending evaluation, temporary placement, home visit recommended. He tried not to read between the lines, but he'd spent his entire life reading between lines. That was how he'd built his empire, by noticing what others missed. Now, what he noticed most was the way Nina watched him. She didn't ask about the woman with the clipboard. She didn't ask about what might happen next, but she noticed the difference in his voice when he took calls. She noticed the way he lingered at the window longer than usual, the way he paused before answering even simple questions. Over breakfast one morning, as he poured cereal into 2 bowls, she spoke without looking up. "You're quieter now." Caleb paused mid-pour. "I've always been quiet," he said, a faint smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. She looked up. "Not like this." He sat across from her and stirred his coffee slowly. "You notice a lot, don't you?" She shrugged. "I have to." There was no pride in her voice, no ego, just truth. It was a skill she'd learned, not because she wanted to, but because survival had required it. Watch the room, read the mood, stay small. He took a breath. "I'm trying to make sure you can stay here," he said, "but some things are complicated." Nina nodded. "I know." How she didn't answer right away, because I've seen what happens when grown-ups get scared. Caleb stared at her, the spoon in his hand now forgotten. There was something haunting about the way she said it. Not bitter, not angry, just factual. He reached across the table and gently turned her drawing around the one she had made that first morning. The building, the window, the man looking up. "This picture," he said. "Why is he smiling?" Nina tilted her head slightly. "Because someone saw him." Caleb blinked. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did too well. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and Seattle shimmered in golden blue, Caleb was in his home office, reviewing floor plans for a new sustainable complex in Vancouver. Normally, his mind would be fully there calculations, logistics, zone and language, but tonight, the lines blurred. He couldn't focus. At 7:04 p.m., a soft knock came at his door. Nina stood in the frame, wearing a clean t-shirt and pajama pants too long for her legs. "I brushed my teeth," she said, "and washed my hands. Do you want to check?" He smiled something small. "Real. No need. I trust you." She blinked at that, as if the idea of being trusted was still a foreign concept. "Okay. Good night. Good night. Nina." She lingered for a second, then turned and padded back down the hall. He listened to her door click shut. Then he looked back at his screen, but the blueprints felt meaningless. For the first time in years, the work didn't hold his attention. There was a child asleep in his home who didn't belong to him. Not yet, but somehow already did. The next morning, he made pancakes. They came out uneven, slightly overcooked on one side, but Nina ate every bite. She even smiled at one point, barely a flicker, but unmistakable. Afterward, she pulled a book from the shelf and sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room. Caleb watched from a distance as she flipped through the pages with care, her fingers trailing under each line. He stepped closer. "What are you reading?" "Fairy tales," she said. "Do you like them?" She nodded. "Some are sad, but I like the ones where people find each other." He didn't respond. Instead, he sat beside her on the rug, quietly, not touching the book, just being there. She didn't move away. That night, after she had gone to sleep, Caleb found himself pacing the kitchen with a glass of water in hand. He had stopped asking himself why he cared. That answer had come and gone. The real question now was, what if it isn't enough? What if the system didn't see what he saw? What if a court only saw a man with no parenting experience, no family history, no approved plan? Would they take her? Could they? He set the glass down and pressed his palms to the countertop. He had never begged for anything in his life, but he would beg for this, not because he was trying to save her, because, in the quiet moments she offered him when she looked at him like he wasn't just some powerful man in a tall building, she had already saved him. It started with a box in the back of a closet. Caleb hadn't opened that part of the storage room in years, not since he moved into the penthouse, not since his mother's last belongings were packed up and sent away in a quiet gesture of finality. The room itself smelled of cardboard and time, a faint layer of dust coating each crate like it had been trying to bury the past inch by inch. He had gone in looking for something else, a blanket for Nina, maybe a board game, something that would make the space feel less temporary. But what he found instead was a small, weathered box labeled in black permanent marker Caleb Personal. He stared at it for a moment. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. He sat on the floor and pried open the flaps. Inside were fragments of a life he had deliberately outgrown, an old fleece sweater that still carried the scent of cedar, a Polaroid of himself at 10, expressionless, standing in front of a nondescript gray building, and at the bottom, a manila folder, his case file. He hadn't seen it in over 2 decades. He didn't even remember keeping it. But here it was, typed in blunt block letters, Hart, Caleb, Daub, 10/14/1985, State Ward File, No, 932 AH. He flipped through the pages with hands steadier than he felt. Yellowed sheets, faded ink, notes from social workers, placement histories, behavioral observations, words like withdrawn, resistant to attachment, emotionally underdeveloped, scrawled in neat handwriting that felt cold now, even as an adult. He stopped at a note dated April 1994. Child remains difficult to bond with, avoids eye contact, rarely engages in imaginative play. Foster parent recommends reassignment due to emotional distance. Caleb closed the file and sat back, staring at the concrete floor. He remembered that house, the worn carpet, the smell of instant noodles, the bunk bed that creaked. But mostly, he remembered the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that grows teeth, the kind that tells a child not to ask for anything, because nothing given stays for long. He hadn't thought about those days in years because he had outworked them, out-earned them, outbuilt them. But now, Nina was here, and her silence didn't have teeth, but it did have history. A history he could see mirrored in the way she folded her clothes too neatly, in the way she paused before entering a room, in the way she looked at people like she was checking the weather in their eyes. And suddenly, Caleb understood something he hadn't before. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was trying to rewrite the chapter of his own life that no one had ever tried to fix. Later that night, he found Nina in the guest room, sitting cross-legged on the rug, flipping slowly through the pages of a children's book. The light from the bedside lamp cast soft halos around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked from the doorway. She looked up and nodded. "It's a nice story." He stepped in and sat on the edge of the bed. "Can I hear it?" She hesitated, then smiled, just a little. "Okay." She started reading, her voice quiet but steady. She stumbled on a few longer words, but she didn't ask for help. She wanted to do it on her own. He watched her, not just the way her lips moved, but the way her eyes lit up when she reached a part she understood, the way she pointed gently at the pictures, the way she paused after each sentence, almost like she was giving it space to settle. When she finished, she closed the book and looked up at him. "Did anyone read to you when you were little?" He shook his head. "No, not really." Nina was quiet for a second. Then she picked up the book again, scooted closer, and placed it between them. "Then maybe I can read to you more." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a small, slow breaking open. "I'd like that," he said. The next morning, he called his legal team. "I want the emergency guardianship paperwork filed," he said. "Today." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, a measured voice replied, "Caleb, I need to be honest with you. The system will push back. You're a single man with no parental experience. This isn't going to be a smooth process." "I don't care," Caleb said. "Do what you have to do." Another pause. Then, "All right, I'll get started." That afternoon, he took Nina shopping. At first, she resisted standing awkwardly near the door of the children's store like she didn't belong. He had to coax her in gently. Show her the aisles of clothes, the walls of books, the shelves of toys. She didn't touch anything at first, walked through like a ghost in a space meant for the living. He picked out soft-colored clothes, warm socks, pajamas with little stars on them. Then he handed her a small basket. "You can pick something, too," he said. "Anything you like." She stood frozen for a moment. "Can I really?" she whispered. He nodded. "Yes." She wandered toward the book section, picked up one volume, a worn paperback collection of fairy tales with golden stars on the cover. "This one," she said. just one book, but she clutched it like it was gold. That night, she sat next to him on the couch as he read aloud to her. Her head rested lightly against his arm. The book was old, the stories familiar, but they felt new now. Fresh, real. She didn't say much afterward, but she didn't need to. Because as she leaned into him, the silence between them was full of breath, full of warmth, full of something neither of them had known they were missing. Caleb had prepared for 1,000 meetings in his life, boardroom battles, investor presentations, land development disputes with city councils and planning commissions, but none of that felt anything like this. He stood in front of his full-length mirror, adjusting a tie he hadn't worn since the last corporate gala. Every motion was precise. Shirt crisp, suit perfect, shoes shined from the outside. He looked like the same man who'd led Hartwell Dynamics to become one of the fastest-growing architecture firms on the West Coast. But inside, his heartbeat felt uneven. His hands kept tightening into fists. Because this wasn't a business deal. This was a courtroom, and Nina's future was about to be discussed like a set of logistics. The night before the hearing, he hadn't slept. He'd sat in his office for hours, staring at the folder on his desk documents, affidavits, psychological evaluations, and a personal statement he'd rewritten over and over again. None of it felt like enough. None of it said the thing that mattered most, that she wasn't just a child who needed a place to stay. She had become the part of him that made everything else make sense. So, just after midnight, he opened a new page. No headers, no formatting, just words. And he wrote, "I didn't save her. She saved me. The night I found her, I was a man with everything wealth, status, power, but I had no idea how hollow I'd become. She didn't ask for help. She didn't beg. She just kept cleaning, like she believed that was the only way she was allowed to exist. I've built towers that scrape the sky. I've designed cities, but I've never built anything more important than the space I've made for her. She taught me that presence matters more than perfection. That family isn't about blood. It's about showing up and staying. And I intend to stay." The courthouse was smaller than Caleb expected. No high ceilings, no marble floors, just neutral carpet, beige walls, and uncomfortable chairs that looked like they'd been ordered from a discount catalog. Nina sat beside him in a soft green dress Lydia had chosen, her dark hair pulled back into a neat braid. On her wrist was a silver bracelet Caleb had given her the night before, her initials engraved on the inside. She'd cried when she opened it. Not loudly, not even from joy. Just that kind of overwhelmed stillness that comes when a child realizes she has been remembered. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with a kind face and sharp eyes. She reviewed the file in front of her while the court-appointed guardian ad litem introduced herself and gave a brief summary. Then came the questions. To Caleb, why do you believe you're the best option for her care? Do you have experience with children? How will you manage your career and parental responsibilities? He answered each one with quiet confidence. Not rehearsed, just honest. I don't have experience, he admitted, but I'm learning every day, and I've already restructured my work schedule to make her the priority she deserves to be. The social worker Jean Halbrook gave her professional assessment. Neutral, but laced with caution. He's proven stability, resources, emotional investment, but the lack of prior family involvement and the speed at which this connection has developed are noted concerns. Caleb expected that. What he didn't expect was how his stomach twisted when they turned to Nina. She was so small in that chair, her feet not reaching the floor, her fingers gently stroking the tail of her stuffed fox. "Nina," the judge said gently, "can you tell me, in your own words, where you'd like to live, Silence?" For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Then Nina lifted her head. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "I want to stay with him," she said, "because when I was alone, I didn't feel real, but when he talks to me, I feel like I exist, like I matter, and I never want to go back to not mattering." The courtroom held its breath. Caleb did too. The judge made a small note on the page in front of her. Then she looked up, meeting Caleb's eyes. "This court grants temporary guardianship to Mr. Caleb Hart," she said. "Pending further evaluation and review, the child will remain in his care." He didn't exhale until Nina reached for his hand and squeezed it. And for the first time in his life, not as a CEO, not as an orphan, not as a man trying to build something permanent, he felt chosen. Not by the court, by her. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, a rare break in the Seattle spring. Caleb bent down and lifted Nina into his arms. She clung to him, face pressed to his shoulder. "Is it okay that it still doesn't feel real?" she whispered. He held her tighter. "It feels real to me, every second." Monday mornings were supposed to be predictable. But predictability had become a thing of the past since Nina came into Caleb's life. And yet, nothing could have prepared him for the soft knock on his office door just after 10 a.m. and the hushed voice of his assistant as she stepped inside. "There's someone here to see you. She says she's Nina's mother." Time slowed. Caleb set down his pen carefully, like any sudden motion might crack the floor beneath him. He had been told Nina's parents were out of the picture, that they had relinquished or lost their rights, that there were no viable biological claims. She gave a name he asked. The assistant nodded. "Emily Ruiz." His throat tightened. "I'll see her." He stood and walked down the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. In the glass-walled conference room at the end, a woman sat hunched over the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked young, maybe early 30s, with long dark hair pulled back and tired eyes that had seen too much. She looked up when he entered. "Mr. Hart," she said quietly. He didn't sit right away. He studied her face, looking for anything that matched Nina. And there it was, around the eyes, the slight downturn of the mouth, a trace of someone who once held her as a baby and then let go. "You're her mother." Emily nodded. "I was told you were dead. I might as well have been," she said. Her voice didn't rise. "I was deep in addiction. I lost custody. I didn't fight it. I didn't think I deserved to." Caleb's jaw clenched. "I've been clean for 14 months now. I finished a recovery program. I have a job. I rent a small apartment. I don't want to take her from you, I swear. I just want to see her. I want her to know. I didn't forget." He stayed silent for a long moment. "You know, she thinks no one's ever come back for her." Emily looked down at her hands. "That's what I want to change. Even if it's too late to be her mom, maybe I can just be someone who didn't give up." Caleb's instinct was to say no, to protect, to shield, to keep the world out. But another part of him, the boy who had once waited by a window for someone who never returned, understood the courage it took to show up now. That night, he sat Nina down in the living room. She was drawing quietly. the silver bracelet on her wrist catching the lamplight. He spoke gently. "Nina, someone came to see me today." She looked up, instantly alert. "It was your mom." Nina didn't speak. "She's clean now. She's working. She wants to see you, just to talk." Still, silence. Caleb leaned in slightly. "She said she doesn't want to take you. She just wants to explain." Nina looked at her drawing. "Does she want me to live with her now?" "No," Caleb said quickly. "Only if you ever want to. But I will never ask you to leave. I promised you that." She nodded slowly. "Can you come with me?" Of course. The meeting took place 2 days later in a quiet office at a neutral child services building. A counselor was present, sitting in the corner with a clipboard, but said nothing unless needed. Emily entered nervously, clutching her purse like a life raft. When she saw Nina, she stopped short. Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. She didn't run forward. She simply knelt a few feet away and said, "You're so much taller than I remember." Nina stood by Caleb's side, her fox clutched in her arms. She didn't move forward either. Emily spoke. She talked about mistakes, about pain, about regret and not knowing how to fix what she broke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I just want you to know I never stopped loving you." Nina looked at her for a long time. Then, softly, "I don't remember your voice." Emily's face cracked, but she didn't cry. "That's okay," she said. "Maybe one day you will." On the way home, Nina sat in the back seat in silence. Just before they pulled into the garage, she looked up at Caleb. "Will you still be my dad? Even if I talk to her sometimes," his heart clenched. "Always," he said. She nodded and rested her head on his arm. And in that small motion, Caleb felt something both break and heal inside him. She hadn't chosen between two parents. She had chosen for herself. She had chosen honesty and peace, and a love that didn't need exclusivity to be real. Later that night, Caleb stood in the hallway outside her door. He listened to the soft hum of her breathing through the crack in the frame. And he thought about how far they'd come. From a girl with raw hands and quiet eyes cleaning his floor at midnight, to this where she could finally fall asleep without bracing for loss. Spring in Seattle came slowly. The air was still cool, but softer now, less edge, more invitation. The cherry blossoms near Caleb's building had begun to bloom, and every morning, the sidewalks were dusted with delicate pink petals that clung to the soles of shoes like whispered promises. Inside the penthouse, life had settled into something steady, not perfect, not dramatic, just real. Nina laughed more now. She left her drawings out on the coffee table without asking. She ran to the kitchen barefoot in the mornings, still half asleep, her fox tucked under one arm. She no longer checked the door 3 times before bed. Caleb noticed every change. He didn't always comment, but he saw it all the way her trust had shifted from conditional to natural. The way her silences were no longer a defense but a choice. And in the quiet rhythms of their new life together, something grew that he hadn't expected. Peace. But peace, Caleb had learned, wasn't just for keeping, it was for sharing. The idea came to him the day he passed a boarded-up school building in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood during a business trip. The windows were cracked, weeds grew through the pavement. A faded sign above the rusted gates read, "Hope Street Public School." He stared at it for a long time. That night, he made a call, and 2 months later, The paperwork was signed. He bought the building. He named it the Nina House, not just in honor of her, but in honor of every child who had been overlooked, overworked, or unseen. It wouldn't be a shelter. It would be a space to belong, a place for kids in crisis to find safety, creativity, therapy, mentorship, and most importantly, people who listened. Nina visited the site with him every week. She chose the lavender for the reading room walls. She helped stock the kindness cupboard with essentials. She placed the first books on the shelf herself, beginning with the fairy tale collection Caleb had bought her that first week. One afternoon, she stood in the middle of the atrium and looked up at the skylight being installed. "You used to build buildings," she said. "I still do," Caleb replied, "but now you're building something else." He smiled. "I'm building a place where someone like you never has to feel invisible again." She nodded. "That's the best thing you've ever built." At the opening, there was no press, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a quiet gathering of volunteers, a few friends, and a small group of children. Nina gave the first tour. She walked them through every room, her voice clear and steady. "This is the art room. You can paint anything you want here. This is the quiet room. You don't have to talk if you don't feel like it. This is the kindness cupboard. Everything in here is free if you need it." At the end of the tour, she paused in the hallway. "I know what it feels like to be nobody," she said to the group, "but this place is for people who need to be reminded they're somebody." That night, Caleb and Nina sat on the steps outside the building, eating ice cream from paper cups. Above them, the stars blinked into view. Nina leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think we made something good," she said. Caleb looked down at her, the bracelet still on her wrist, her hair curling slightly in the spring air. He nodded. "We didn't just make something," he said. "We made each other." And in that moment, under the soft hum of a city finally slowing down, forever didn't feel like something borrowed anymore. It felt like home. Not every child gets a fair start in life. Not every child is seen, heard, or loved. Nina didn't ask for pity. She didn't cry out. She simply learned to make herself small enough to survive in a world that never made room for her. And maybe that's what makes this story so powerful, because it reminds us that love isn't proven by blood, it's proven by presence, by showing up again and again, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable. Caleb Hart could have turned away. He had every reason to. But instead, he listened, he stayed, and through that simple act of staying, a child who had been invisible became somebody. But this story also forces us to look inward at the systems that fail the most vulnerable, at the judgments we make about who deserves a second chance, and at the ways society labels people as problems instead of people in pain. This isn't just a story about rescue, it's about recognition, about choosing humanity when it would be easier to hide behind rules, reputation, or silence. And if that moved you even just a little, we invite you to stay with us. Like this video if it made you feel something. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that love is still alive in this world. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because the world needs more than headlines and noise. It needs hope. This is just one story, but there are so many more. And maybe the next one will be the one you never forget. Until next time, thank you for watching.